Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. All right, as for this episode, our featured guest is David Kaufman, who has an absolutely fascinating background. Now, David is an editor and writer based here in New York City. He's the global digital director at Architectural Digest and was founding editor-in-chief of News.com, the news search and discovery platform from News Corp. David is a former New York Times editor, the former global lifestyle editor at Quartz, and spent nearly 5 years at the New York Post, one of my all-time favorite papers, where he was travel, home, and design editor, as well as editor-in-chief of Alexa, the Post lifestyle publication. He was also the former editor of Time Out Tel Aviv's English language edition. David is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists and is a member of the Board of Trustees at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art. He lives here in Manhattan and is the proud father of amazing twin boys. And with that, we very warmly welcome David Kaufman to IsraelCast, who joins us now via Zoom. David, a pleasure to have you aboard the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, David, I just shared some of your professional highlights, but I'd really love for our listeners to get to know you, David, as a person. So tell us a bit about your background and some of those influences that you've had in your life thus far.
Well, I've been in New York for probably 25 years now, but I'm a native San Franciscan. I was born there and raised there in the 70s and 80s. My mom is Jewish. She's a regular old American Jewish person, Ashkenazi. Parents immigrated from Europe. She's first generation, grew up religious, almost sort of Orthodox in a Yiddish-speaking home. My father's African-American, grew up in suburban Houston, church-going family. And my parents kind of somehow found each other and met and came together in San Francisco in the late 60s and early 70s, kind of like the hippie period and free love. And I guess the love was free enough that my sister and I appeared, and here we are. I was raised Jewish, but mostly by my mom. We were raised, quite Jewish. Went to a synagogue in San Francisco. I had a b'nai mitzvah because I'm a twin. Spent time in Jewish youth movements and went to both Jewish and non-Jewish summer camps. Have spent quite a lot of time in Israel over the course of my many years. And I hope to spend more time there in the future. For obvious reasons, that's been difficult.
Right. David, you shared with me a story just the other day when we were having a conversation about the influence that your grandmother had on you. And I'm just wondering if you can share that with our listeners.
Sure. It's a kind of a cute story. Hopefully, if I ever write a book about my life, it'll be probably part of the first chapter. But as I said, my mom was raising us by herself, and she'd sort of strayed from religion a bit. My mom is extremely culturally Jewish. She's an archetypical Jewish mother and a very wonderful Jewish grandmother. And she was sort of raising us nothing for the first few years of our lives. I think even one year, God forbid, we even had a Christmas tree in the house, although I do believe there were dreidels on it. And we'd gone to visit my paternal grandparents, the African-American grandparents in Texas for a summer, who are great and wonderful, loving, wonderful people. My mom's family had sort of distanced themselves from her when we were born. So my mom felt it was very important that even though we weren't particularly close to our father, that we were close to his family. My mom always wanted to make sure that my sister and I knew who we were, knew who our family was, and knew where we came from. Unlike many kids, I guess, who come from our sort of backgrounds, we always knew who we were, and we always knew what we were, where we came from, and who our family was, and that we were loved and wanted. So we went to our grandparents in Texas. It was a great summer. We went to NASA and saw, spaceships and things like that, and went swimming in the Gulf of Texas, or whatever you call that body of water near Houston. And my grandmother,
Gulf of Mexico, I think it's called.
Yeah, Mexico. I'm like a Texan national from the early 19th century. Anyway, so my grandmother, who was very Baptist and church going, never had an issue with my mom being Jewish and had no issue with us being half Jewish or whatever, but was very horrified that my mom wasn't taking us to any sort of organized religious institution, be it temple or be it a church. She was very concerned about that. And I remember she called my mom after the visit and said, you must take these children somewhere. I don't care if they're Hare Krishnas. I just don't want my babies becoming no heathens. And so my mom, emboldened by that and not having her own parents by her side, took it upon herself to take us to a synagogue because that's what she knew. She had a friend from the JCC where we did swimming lessons in San Francisco who were also a mixed race family. And we went to the same synagogue as her and that family. And we stayed there for our whole lives. And I always sort of joke that that's the story of how my Black Baptist grandmother made us Jewish.
Because there is something to be said, David, for spirituality, no matter what stream of spirituality that is.
So for her, it wasn't about, which institution we went to or which building or which religion or which God. It was just that we had something that was guiding us in life. And I'm forever grateful for her for that.
Because it's about values at the end of the day, isn't it?
It's not just about values. I think it's about feeling connected to something bigger than yourselves. One thing I always say about being Jewish is that it's something that's bigger than me or you or any of us per se. It's about having a connection to a history, a lineage, a shared story that goes back unbroken for 5,500 years. And we are part of that. And, there aren't a lot of other ethnic or religious groups today that can say that. There just really aren't. Most ethnic groups or nations last for centuries, maybe a millennia, but they don't last for five millennia and 5+ millennia. So I feel proud to be part of that connection. I feel proud to be part of that story, and I feel proud to. I also feel proud of the fact that somebody who wasn't connected to that story helped me get there.
Indeed. David, generally people don't think of the diversity within the Jewish community, assuming all Jews are Ashkenazi, they're all from Eastern Europe, they all look like me. So how do you respond to that?
I mean, it's interesting. I grew up in a family that the Jews that I knew didn't look like you. My sister looks like me, and my cousin, who's half Hawaiian or Asian and half Jewish, looks half Hawaiian and half Asian and half Jewish. So for me, within our little family, the standard for Jews was actually not particularly white. So I didn't necessarily grow up with that archetype, but of course I understand it. I think for me, there's sort of two sides to it. Again, because I grew up in a family where there was quite a bit of diversity, and because I spent so much of my life, really now at this ripe old age, really the majority of my life has been spending lots of time in Israel, I'm extremely used to seeing and being surrounded by Jews who aren't particularly white. For me, that has been the majority of my experience. Also, I've traveled quite a bit around the world. I've been very lucky. So I've met Jews all over the world who are Sephardic or Mizrahi or not exactly white the way we think of them. So for me, this idea of Jews being white is a very American notion that I don't particularly align with or identify with. So I know that today there's a very strong and I think very necessary movement towards galvanizing Jews of color into sort of an identity group. And I support that. I don't necessarily personally feel the need to be strongly aligned with that movement, only because my experience has been that Jews have always been diverse and have always been of many colors. But I understand the fact that this is a burgeoning movement and a necessary one.
Yeah, building on that, I loved what the late Lubavitcher Rebbe would say. He would always, be asked about different labels of Jews, and he would say labels are for clothes.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is important to note is that I think the key, at least in my experience, my view, and I only speak from my experience and from my view. I don't speak for anybody but myself. But I think the shared commonality in this country of Jews of color has been one of, in a sense, rejection. I think folks are always questioning whether or not we're Jewish, or they assume we're not Jewish, or they're wondering how we're Jewish. And I think this is something that a lot of Jews of color have kind of had enough of. we're sort of tired of being people asking us how we're Jewish, or what we do that's Jewish, or who's Jewish. I remember I went to Brandeis University, which could not be a more Jewish place, and I remember a few instances where, I won't name names or anything like that. I'm not a canceller or out to like bash people, but very prominent professors who should have known better were very free and open with sort of questioning how I was Jewish. And my answer was sort of probably the same way you are, or I was just born this way, or, ask my mom, she's the Jewish one, you know what I mean? But I always felt very sort of taken aback by the brazenness in which folks seemed willing or entitled or allowed to question my Judaism. And I think this experience of having our identities questioned, and in a sense, our loyalty or alignment with Judaism questioned in a way that white people aren't, I think this is something that is galvanizing Jews of color today, especially younger Jews of color, to say, we've had enough of this. We won't accept this, and we want to be accepted on who we are and on our own terms.
It's interesting.
We have nothing to prove.
It's interesting that you say that, David, because I'm wondering, have those perceptions changed over time? Have they evolved?
I mean, I don't know. That's my answer. Some days I would say yes. Some day, I live in Upper East Side of Manhattan. I live on the same block as a Chabad center. Some days, when I say, Shabbat Shalom to the folks walking by, they're smiling and thrilled. And some days they're totally puzzled and perplexed. So I don't know if the things have changed. One of the like the cheeky or kind of humorous, but not so humorous subtext of my entire life has been that because of my extremely Jewish sounding name, when folks are meeting me for the first time, they're extremely surprised that I look like this, or this is me, or they'll walk out to a reception and ask and call for me and look at everybody there except for me. That there's less of that today. But also I'm at an age where and particularly now for the past year, where I just meet less people. So is there less of that because I'm meeting less people, or because people are more enlightened? I really don't know. So I don't know if that's changed so much, but I hope it has.
And as you said, certainly when you go to Israel, you see the mosaic of the Jewish people there, and certainly from outward appearances.
That's, of course. I mean, one of the things I like about being in Israel is that I'm hardly the darkest Jew in the room. And that actually feels, it feels nice. I mean, folks have often asked me, like, what are one of the things I like? I like many things about being in Israel. But I think a pretty profound thing for me is that as somebody who comes from a mixed background, I'm not exactly white, I'm not exactly black, I'm kind of brown. For one thing, being Jewish has always been something that's been a certainty. For me, I've often questioned my race in many ways, but never my identity as a Jew. It's been a fixed thing. And what also is that in most of my life, in places I go, I'm different than most people around me, and it's been that way my whole life. And I'm fine with that. I don't worry about that. It doesn't give me angina late at night. But I will say that when I'm in Israel and I walk past Kaufman Street in Tel Aviv, there's something nice about being just like everybody else. There's something nice and kind of a relief of just being the same as everybody else around me, because it's something I've experienced so little of, and it's something I don't take for granted. So it's a nice experience at times to be part of the majority, and that's, I think, one of the things I like about being in Israel.
It must be awfully nice to have a street in Israel with your last name on it, because to the best of my knowledge, there's no Shalowitz Street in Israel yet.
Not yet. But I hear they're working on it.
Okay. Well, if you have anything to say about it or anything to do with that, more power to you, David. Well, I do want to pivot to Israel then right now, because you've spent a considerable amount of time there. So tell us about your Israel story, your time there, what brought you there in the first place, and why did you stay so long?
Well, I went for the first time when I was 16 with my synagogue group from San Francisco. It was a very big trip for us. I'd never really traveled that far in my life. And I remember we pit stopped in New York and we flew over the Greek islands. It was very exciting. One thing that's really funny is that We actually flew on an El Al flight from San Francisco years ago. I'm not going to give the exact date. I don't think I'm dating myself, but it was the first El Al flight ever to fly out of San Francisco, and it was a kind of like a big deal. And there was all this media at San Francisco airport seeing us off. And we were all waving, and it was really excited. And of course, we were like 50, 16-year-olds, really thrilled to be leaving our family. And then we got to Tel Aviv, and we landed at Ben Gurion at the old airport, which is not like the new airport. And we got out of the airport, we left, immigration, and went out to the front. And then the old airport, people were just there, kind of like on a street, with waiting for their family. But I thought they were all waiting for us, because there had been all these people back in San Francisco seeing us off, and I thought that the people in Israel were like waiting for us to be excited about this plane. So when we landed, and we walked out and saw these people, I was like, hi, we're here. And of course, nobody paid attention to me and thought, who is this crazy kid with a little afro? So that was my first trip to Tel Aviv, to Israel. And then I went again a year and a half later to Alexander Muss High School in Israel for 2 months. Then I went again. Now I'll start dating myself for the year of the first Gulf War. That was my first war in Israel. I still have my gas mask, and I was at Tel Aviv University for the year, which was great. And then I went back to the United States and studied, and just kept on going to Israel here and there for a few months, seeing my very close friends who I'd met during those previous visits, many of whom are still very close to me today. Finally, in about 15 years ago, one of my close friends applied some nice Jewish guilt, saying, we haven't seen you for a while. My parents are asking for you. My sister had a baby. She wants you to see her baby. Why don't you come visit us? So I said, it was during the height of the Second Intifada, and I was a little bit like, convinced by CNN that I wouldn't survive a visit. But I said, well, I'm going to Milan, so I guess I'll be in the neighborhood. I'll pop by. And I have a little funny story about that too. Israel's so full all my Israel trips are so full of great stories. I was in Milan airport, going to Ben Gurion, about to hop onto El Al. And I'd used miles for the flight, because I wasn't going to spend money to go to Israel because, of the situation. And I get there, and the guy was, grilling me at Ben Gurion airport. He was a nice guy. And he is like, you bought this ticket with miles, but you bought your return ticket with cash, and you were in Milan, and you're going to Tel Aviv, and what's going on? And I'm like, you just said it. It's very clear. I'm telling you the truth. He's like, who are you visiting in Tel Aviv? And I gave him the names of my friends. We're going to call them. I'm like, all right, call them. They'll be happy to hear from you. They're waiting for me to show up. So they go to the back, and you know how it is with El Al or Ben Gurion Airport. Everything, they're always going to the back, to a back room to deal with situations. They went to the back. He came back. The line's busy. I'm like, okay. So he goes back again. The line's busy. I'm like, okay. He goes back again. The line's busy. I'm like, would you like his cell phone number? And they're like, oh, no, our line is busy here. And I'm like, well, how many phones do you have? He's like, we only have one. So I said to him, sir, my country needs to give your country some more money so you can buy some more phones. And with that, he let me on the plane.
I love that. David, I see you. David, I see you've got the chutzpah nailed.
I got it. You got to have it. It's a survival mechanism. That year, I went to Tel Aviv for the first time in quite a long time. Number one, and I was really taken aback at how great it was and how much fun I was having there, and how I'd also spent a lot of time in New York at that period, living in New York, and I was a little bit fed up with New York. I was fed up with, the rat race. I was fed up with the lack of kind of intimacy of New York, the lack of kind of strong friendships and strong connections to people. And in Israel, I found that immediately, and people were, for whatever reason, they were thrilled to have me there. And I, after that trip, I decided this was in the fall, I would come back and spend the summer there. So I went back to spend the summer there and had a great time. At the time, Israel was not like it is today. It was extremely cheap. I should have bought all of Tel Aviv, but I didn't. Now I could retire. And so I was living this kind of groovy, fun, along the beach life. I bought a bike, and I would go kickboxing, and I would, eat a different kind of hummus every day. And I decided to stay. I had felt like there was no reason to go back to New York. Nothing there was particularly waiting for me. My mom was not happy. My friends were not happy, but I was like, you can come visit me too. And I stayed for 3 years.
David, I think we're kindred spirits here because in 2005, see, you took the plunge. I didn't. In 2005, after I left Singapore, I had been in Asia for 16 years, all over China and then Singapore. And I was taking an around the world trip, and Israel was one of my stops. And I purposely was there during Pesach, had, the holiday with friends. And then I started traveling in the region, returned to Israel, traveled a little more in the region, returned back to Israel. And I thought to myself, why don't I just stay here? And I really almost stayed at that point in 2005, but there were rather compelling reasons for me to make it back to the United States. So I did. So I never ended up staying. So I totally understand your draw to the place in sort of, Tel Aviv in terms of, people like to say that it's sort of Manhattan meets Miami. I think of it as sort of like Rio, actually.
That's
I don't know if
correct.
you've spent any time in Rio or not, but it's very much like a Rio type of vibe. And I think that's what's the allure for so many people, at least about Tel Aviv. But certainly Israel in and of itself definitely has a draw for so many people and for a variety of reasons. So I want to talk about Tel Aviv because you know Tel Aviv really intimately.
I do, although I haven't been there for almost 5 years now, so I don't know how intimate today, but it's a little bit, my intimacy is a bit dated, but yes.
But because I'm not going to ask you what's the best restaurant to eat now or what's the best this or that at this particular moment, at this particular time. But personally, I'm a big architecture fan. And we should share with our podcast listeners that we're also recording this via Zoom video. And so on video right now, I'm going to hold up for David 2 books that I have that I brought about.
I have that book.
You have this book. This is Dwelling on the Dunes, Tel Aviv. It's a heavy book and I absolutely love it. And then the second book that I have that I'm going to hold up is this one. Do you have Tel Aviv's Modern Movement?
I believe I do have that. I believe there's a second cover under the first cover. And I believe that is how it looks for me today. But I believe I have that book as well.
Got it. Because again, is a huge architecture fan and the whole Bauhaus spirit of Tel Aviv. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the city. Is really an architectural gem. It's known as the White City. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's one of the reasons.
Not the whole city.
Not the whole city. Yes, I know. Not the whole city. There is a footnote there, but it's one of the reasons why I absolutely love Tel Aviv is to roam around it. And so talk a little bit about the architecture there.
What I think what I like about Tel Aviv is that the architecture is that it's really kind of requires patience. It's not an initially beautiful city in many ways at all. I would say that some parts, the older parts, particularly in Yaffo, are quite beautiful from the first look. Those sections aren't traditionally Jewish, though. The more traditionally Arab. But Tel Aviv itself is not a particularly initially beautiful city. So you have to have some patience when visiting. As you said before, Tel Aviv is sort of the Bauhaus, the capital of the world. Bauhaus and modernism buffs would know that, but many people don't know that. Jews who were part of the Bauhaus movement in the 20s and 30s in Europe fled to then mandate Arab Palestine and created this kind of modernist gem on the beach, on the dunes. Part of that was the artistic aesthetic that they knew back in Germany. And also part of it was that Bauhaus architecture in the main is cheap, efficient, and very functional. So it served the needs of a burgeoning mass population at that time.
And if I can interrupt you there for a second, they also adapted it, though, to the climatic conditions of Tel Aviv, because certainly Tel Aviv weather is very different than German weather.
Exactly. And which is why, for instance, the element of the brise soleil is so prominent in Israel, in Tel Aviv, amongst Bauhaus architecture in order to encourage the passage of wind to reduce the stifling summer heat. So Tel Aviv is this sort of, unexpected Bauhaus gem, which I love roaming around the streets, often on bike, looking. I also love palm trees. What I like most about the Bauhaus, it requires sort of a fine eye. You have to be, not that I have such a refined eye, but I have a refined eye for this. But you have to be willing to sort of do the work, as they say, with Bauhaus, to go look at the buildings, to see the curved facades and the porthole windows and the brise soleils and the empalates, as they call them, the buildings that are elevated onto sort of stilts, and see the beauty in that, because there is a real beauty in that. It's not sort of a traditional sort of Western European, North American kind of beauty. There's no brick and there's not a lot of wood, but it's an interesting and unique vernacular that is very much suited for the place and the time. And a lot what makes architecture great anywhere in the world is that it's appropriate and conforms to the necessities and the demands of the environment around it. And Bauhaus architecture certainly fulfills that demand in Israel. I do want to say, though, that as much as we focus on Bauhaus architecture in Israel, I'm actually a bigger fan of eclectic architecture, which you find in Tel Aviv. The most noted example of that is what they call the Pagoda building in King Albert Square, which is also part of the White City. Eclectic architecture predates Bauhaus by probably 10 to 20 years. It's extremely emblematic of the British mandate, sort of colonial era. Eclectic architecture has many of the similar kind of macro features of Bauhaus in terms of the overall structure, but it is far more refined, in my opinion, with more kind of European or sort of Levantine detailing. What I love most about eclectic architecture is that it draws upon the influences of, and this is why they call it eclectic, it draws upon the influences of the surrounding nations or the surrounding Ottoman era provinces, particularly say Alexandria and northern Egypt at the time, but also it draws upon other parts of the British Empire, of which Palestine was then part of, such as India and sort of Luton, the architect who's responsible for Delhi, or even sort of the architecture you'd find in, say, South Africa, or I've even seen elements of eclectic references and influences in Central America. So it's very much an internationalist style, but not what we call the internationalist style. It's a cosmopolitan style that really looks towards the rest of the world, but feels very appropriate for the Levant of the early 20th century. So it's fascinating.
And I oftentimes think if the walls could talk. I remember years ago, dear friends of mine took me on a literary walking tour of Tel Aviv. And it was a guided tour. And we were shown where the well-known authors lived and the poets lived. And so Tel Aviv has a very long cultural history as well, right? Now, it's not only just a commercial center.
No, I mean, I think the notion of Tel Aviv as a commercial center is actually quite recent. You know, Tel Aviv of the first half of its existence was very much the center of Israeli cultural production, poetry, song, ballet, film, music, and theater, of course. And I think what's great about Israel and about Tel Aviv as well is that Israel's a very sort of still a very informal culture, and it's unfussy. So you can feel very free to go to the Philharmonic in a suit and tie, or you can feel free to go in shorts and a t-shirt, and I think people will feel just as welcome. And I like that about culture in Israel. It's very embracing and it doesn't feel exclusionary, which I think is important.
Well, speaking of the Philharmonic, there's the famous story when Willy Brandt came to Tel Aviv and Golda Meir was asked, what should we show him? And I don't know if you know this story or not. Maybe some of our listeners do. And she decided, let's show him the White City. Let's show him all the Bauhaus architecture, the beautiful architecture that we have around the city. So they did a walking tour. They ended up at Habima Square, and Golda said, this is the Mann Auditorium. Willy Brandt got all excited and asked how it came to be named after Thomas Mann, the famous novelist and writer and Nobel laureate. And Golda said that it was actually named after Frederick Mann of Philadelphia, to which Willy Brandt asked, what did he write? And apparently, without missing a beat, Golda said, a check. So there you go. I love that story. So let me ask you a question. If David Kaufman was to take yours truly and one of our lucky guests on the David Kaufman hidden tour of Tel Aviv, what would you like to share with us? What would you like to show us?
I mean, I don't know if it'd be so hidden, but it'd just be places that I enjoyed spending time when I of course would go to the Sugar Carmel. I think that for those of us who've grown up in America, the United States, and I very much grew up in the United States, I'm very American, the idea of sort of these like bustling outdoor markets is very odd and still something that we don't necessarily identify with. So I remember the first time I went to the Carmel market in Tel Aviv, with the noise and the smell and the kind of the clamor. It just feels so of place. One thing that is, I think, is a complicated element of Israel's existence is that it's in the Middle East, and we know it's in the Middle East, and we talk about that, but we don't necessarily kind of truly reflect upon that and think about that in many times because of the complexity around that situation. So for me, the Carmel market and of course the Machne Yehuda market in Jerusalem just feels so Levantine. They take me to a place that's so different from where I came from, but also feel connected to the world, the nations around Israel, which I think can be another hard topic to delve into. But the markets feel very much of place. So that's what I love. My first place to go would be just an eating tour of the Carmel market. One thing that's great is that over the last 10 years, you've really seen like kind of foodie culture permeate into Tel Aviv and all over Israel, really. But initially there were these kind of high-end fancy restaurants, but then you saw kind of these pop up little like miznonim type places, little spots. And in the market, you see, near a butcher, there's like a few tables set out with a little kind of like pop up, groovy but extremely high-end, well executed meat place. Or you have, a place making amazing barekas next to the kind of old-fashioned bareka stand, or a place serving amazing coffee next to the traditional coffee stand. So they've really invested in these high-end little corners in the market. So that's where I would start, number one. I lived for a period of time in Noga, which is kind of a groovy, eclectic-esque neighborhood in southern Tel Aviv, where Tel Aviv meets Yaffo, and it kind of ends pouring onto the Mediterranean. It's full of these renovated warehouses that have been turned into homes or little shops or galleries. So I love Noga a lot. I love the area just above that, the Florentine area, which also just feels very bustling. It also feels quite international because it's an area where lots of immigrants have poured into. And it also is interesting for me to see the evolution of immigrant culture in Tel Aviv, especially non-Jewish immigrant culture in what's essentially a Jewish city, and how Israel kind of assimilates that. I remember one year walking around Florentine, you saw all these Christmas trees because so many of the folks who lived there could be from the Philippines or from West Africa. So you saw Christmas trees and Christmas lights and ornaments for sale, which I thought was just so curious and interesting. And I'm somebody, I think because of my own background, that loves to see hybrid cultures evolving, and Florentine and that area is really where you see it in Tel Aviv, and I love seeing that. I love, of course, walking around, Rothschild Boulevard and seeing the really exquisite kind of like prime examples of the Bauhaus movement. Also, Cheekjow with impressive skyscrapers. There's one there by I.M. Pei, there's one by Richard Meyer. So you see kind of the old and new next to each other. And of course, I love spending time in Yaffo. It gives me hope, especially during a dark time, of the possibility of coexistence. It also reminds me that it's a fragile city and a fragile country that requires people to attempt tolerance and to respect tolerance. And when I'm in Jaffa, I'm reminded of the complexity and the fragility of what Israel is today, but it also gives me hope.
Fantastic. It's a busy tour we're going to have, the David Kaufman tour of Tel Aviv. Our listeners know, or many of them do, that I'm vegan. And so for me, going to a place like Tel Aviv, or Israel for that matter, is truly a vegan paradise. And when I was there in February of 2019, we went with Jewish National Fund to do a whole bunch of interviews for IsraelCast. 17 interviews in 5 days. I didn't know who I spoke to by the time I got on the plane. But nevertheless, I'll tell you, every one of those meals was just so incredibly memorable. And the first one that I had was at Sabich, the Sabich place at Frischman and Dizengoff.
And I used to live right across the street from there.
Did you?
Of course, yes.
Okay, so I actually used to stay, or every time I go, actually, I stay at on Gordon Street, which is just a street or two up from there, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And I'm not one of those people that usually takes photos of food and then post them on social media. But I had to take a photo of my sabich there, and I immediately got inundated with messages from people telling me that that was the first place that they actually also go to when they go to Tel Aviv. So there's just such a strong, visceral connection to the food in Israel as well, which is quite exciting. You know, one of my favorite places actually to visit in Tel Aviv is the Ben Gurion House. And I actually had the little leaflet from the Ben Gurion House in one of my Bauhaus books. And I've been there several times, and I love going there because I don't know if you've been there or not, but when you walk in, off to the side, there are quotations from David Ben Gurion, and they featured several of them here in the leaflet. And I wanted to read one of them because I thought it was appropriate for our conversation. And he was purported to have said, quote, "Should I be asked to sum up the Jewish history in a few words, I would say it in 3 words: quality versus quantity." So how do you like that one?
Funny, I like that.
So in any event, I was surprised actually that you didn't mention anything about nightlife, but I was actually very happy that you didn't, because I'm an early bird and I can't stay up too late. So I'm glad that all of our activities on the David Kaufman Tel Aviv tour are going to happen during the day versus after sundown.
There might be like a late night run to, I think it's called Victory. It's an Arab-owned ice cream shop in Yapo that I quite like, or to Abu Lafia for pita snacks. But that's probably it. I'm also an early riser.
Okay, good. So kindred spirits here. So speaking about the diversity of the Jewish experience, can you talk real briefly, David, about Amari Studemire?
So Amari Studemire is an extremely well-known, extremely successful, extremely famous basketball player in America, who considers himself or is part of the Black Hebrew movement. A couple of years ago, and he's very vocally Jewish. I mean, he's raising his children Jewish. He has a Jewish home, basically, wherever he goes. So Amari, after he retired from professional basketball here in the US, he became part of the Hapoel Yerushalayim team, and I believe became part owner of the team, and moved his family, moved his mom and his many children and his wife and his chef to a beautiful villa in Rehavia in Jerusalem. I stumbled upon this information in the Hebrew press one day and was shocked to see that nobody in the US press had written about it. And I was at the New York Post at the time. It was right before my children were about to be born. But I felt like I was in need for another last adventure. So I convinced the editors of the New York Post to send me to Israel, where we hung out with Amari for a week in Jerusalem, and then attended the first game of the season he ever played as part of Hapoel Yerushalayim. So I got to spend all this time with Amari in Jerusalem with his wife, with his mom, who was great. His mom even gave me her absentee ballot. That she's like, "I have my absentee ballot. Can you please take it back to New York and put a stamp on it? And please make sure that you put it in the mailbox. Please, please, please." I'm like, "Of course I will. No problem." And it was great being with Amari because half the day he was taking Hebrew lessons and half the day he was basically practicing basketball. Everybody in Tel Aviv, everybody in Jerusalem where we were, they definitely knew who he was. You know, everywhere we go, folks were like, "Is that him? Is that him?" He didn't speak Hebrew that well, so I was able to sort of help with the translation. But it was great to see, it's just great to be there with him and to spend time with him and to see his impact on the country and to see his enthusiasm for that part of the journey of his life.
That's great. And we'll share a link to your New York Post article about him because it was really, really lovely to read. He's like 7 feet something. Did you feel like a dwarf next to him?
He's not short. I didn't feel like a dwarf because I was just so kind of like starstruck by him. I just was sort of like, I didn't feel like a dwarf. I just felt very kind of, I felt very wow. This is a very wow moment. Because it also was wow because, celebrity culture in Israel is interesting because in America, so much of celebrity culture revolves around the notion of being separate from and inaccessibility. People are famous and celebrities because can't get near them. They lead these kind of Kardashian crazy worlds. In Israel, it's a very small and very intimate culture. So even the most famous people can't really hide. You see them everywhere. And so it was interesting just being with a celebrity and somebody who I knew was internationally famous. This kind of guy's like a big deal all over the world. And seeing how folks respond to that sort of celebrity. But I also like spending time with his family. I like spending time with his wife and his kids, because I just love hearing about what it was like for them to be there, and to hear his wife talk about, they'd moved from, I think, a huge mansion in Miami to this, of course, very beautiful villa in Jerusalem. But she doesn't speak Hebrew, and she doesn't really have any friends there, and she was just sort of talking about what her experience was like, and she was so thrilled to have been so warmly welcomed by the other parents at the international school. And it was her mom who was there. Sorry, not his mom. And the mom was just so, felt so welcomed, and they really felt like this had been the right choice for them at that time.
Or a rather frivolous comment on my part, she had said that she doesn't have to worry about wearing high heels.
Yes, she was.
Because it's so casual in Israel.
Yeah, she was a kind of a stylish woman for sure.
Absolutely. Well, listen, David, I'd like to switch gears here for a moment. As many of our listeners, I'm sure, know, Jewish National Fund is building a $350 million game-changing World Zionist Village in Beersheba, a city we all know and love. It's a 5-year plan. And for it, JNF created an Envision Israel Tomorrow big ideas competition, looking for ideas from around the globe for creative out-of-the-box ideas for different aspects of the campus. So we're talking about things like sculpture, gardens, dorms, etc. Now, you're one of the 10 esteemed jurors selected to judge the competition, so congratulations to you. I understand that as we speak, there are over 75 entries, including from Morocco and even from Iran as well. So that's quite exciting. The prize money's terrific. Congrats on being chosen. What are you looking for then, David, in some of those submissions?
I think a building that looks towards the future, a building that looks towards inclusiveness, a building that looks towards both a student academic focused experience, but also a research experience. And of course, a building that would be architecturally significant and serve as sort of a landmark for decades to come.
Very exciting. The winners will be announced in August, and submissions ends on June 18th. This episode is going to be released on June 9th. So if folks listen to it from June 9th until June 18th, they still have time to submit, and people can go to jnf.org/village for more. Once again, jnf.org/village. And by the way, the jurors will select 10 entries. Do you know about this, David? For the public to vote for a People's Choice Award, and a cash prize will be there for the People's Choice Award. So maybe even I'll submit. I think of myself as a rather creative type.
I think you should. I would definitely support your submission for sure.
Thanks. That's a rousing endorsement right there.
Right there.
So listen, speaking of creativity, I do have to ask you, because you work in a very creative environment at Condé Nast, at Architectural Digest, a stunning magazine. I worked in advertising for more years than I'd like to admit, so also a creative industry. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, David, talk to us about creativity. Do you think that it's something that you're either born with or you learn? Is it a combination of both?
That's a very interesting question. And I guess having small children has really changed my perspective of that. I do believe that there has to be something, I do believe that there's probably something innate in terms of being a creative person, but it's very much, will that innate creativity be cultivated and encouraged and supported? One of my sons, for instance, they're both creative, but one is much more demonstrative and kind of like look at me in a way, and the other one's quieter. And I am curious as to how that will play out in the end. I mean, we encourage both of them to embrace their creativity, but one was, I feel earlier on, he was supported in his creativity because he was just louder about it. I guess the question is that how does that play out throughout a lifetime? If you're louder about your creativity, do you become more creative, or is that going to kind of propel you to that path, or is creativity something that sort of builds upon us? It's more like a slow burn and is encouraged through years and years of practice and refinement. So I'm not 100% sure. I think it's a bit of both. I think with everything, it's nature versus nurture. I think the most important part is to ensure that folks who are creative have the opportunities to express that creativity and the avenues to manifest it.
Yeah, they do have to be cultivated. I think it is all about nurturing that talent. And when you see so many images,
we see a lot.
Okay, and I know you do
all the time.
I know you do. That's why I'm going to ask this. How do you? Is it something that you see, like when you see an image, you say, yes, that's the one we're going with? Is there something that just strikes you at that moment? It's like one glance and you know it kind of thing, or do you have to really peruse it over?
Well, I think for us, that's a layered question. There's two answers to that. There's the traditional media answer, and I would say there's a social media answer to that.
I want both of them.
In the traditional media answer, it's, how does this image look in terms of composition, in terms of balance, in terms of color, in terms of subject matter, in terms of the subtle subtext and messages it's trying to say. These are all the things that are really conveyed through a beautifully executed image, a picture, or a drawing. And that's still extremely important, especially in terms of print. I work in digital, so we're very much concerned with, especially today, how is an image going to look on social media? How is it going to look on a phone? How is it going to look on a screen? How is it going to look with text on it in a small space? How is it going to look forwarded to again and again and again and again? How is it going to look as part of a Instagram story narrative? So really, in many ways today, images are serving a function to promote, are serving a function as a piece of content that just didn't exist 10 years ago. And we're constantly having to kind of reassess what that means, both for ourselves as editors, for our consumers, and of course, as a brand.
Interesting.
It's extremely interesting and exciting.
Yeah, because it's multi-use. I remember back in the day working in advertising, even an image, we still had to consider, how is it going to look in print? How is it going to look in a newspaper versus a magazine? Can we use it for the billboard? And, there are all those questions, but now it's become even more complicated with the whole digital landscape.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, listen, really, as we wind down our conversation, David, you do so many things. What is it that you think you're best at?
I think I'm best at, I don't know. I mean, I think the necessity of my life is that I'm best at time management. I've always been very good at time management. I kind of know how to take on multiple tasks at one time and get them done. I have a problem saying no. I like to do things. I like to be busy. So I think I'm best at time management, but I know this is going to sound incredibly cheesy and cliche, but I guess the thing I hope I'm best at is being a father, a friend, and a son. At the end of the day, this is what lasts. This is what's important. And the greatest contribution I will make is the children I leave behind. So I hope that's what I'm best at. And that's what I hope I become even better at.
It is all about relationships at the end of the day, after all. Well, David Kaufman, we're very glad that you said yes to this interview. And we just want to thank you so much for a terrific conversation and for joining us right here on IsraelCast. And we'll have info about you, David, on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And before I share with you, our dear listeners, ways that you can listen to the show, reach out to us, and more, just to reiterate what Dave and I were talking about just a moment ago, Jewish National Fund USA is calling on all budding architects and artists, including yours truly, to envision tomorrow's Israel and submit ideas for the competition to help design the new World Zionist Village being built in Beersheba, Israel. Do submit your innovative ideas for key elements of the village, which will feature a high school study abroad campus, a post-college internship program, adult education opportunities, and so much more. There are cash prizes, as we said, for the winner and several finalists and the People's Choice Award. So do go to jnf.org/village to learn more and submit your ideas. And once again, the competition closes on June 18th, 2021. So mark your calendars for that, June 18th, 2021. All right, as for IsraelCast, well, I think you know by now that we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. And while you're at it, don't forget to rate and review us to make it easier for more people around the world to find us. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. It's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Alicia Yaffe, Dara Shapiro, and Kevin Solka. Our editors are Jay Rothman, Roman Molino-Dunn, and Jake McGuire from Miratone Studios in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top and tail of the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more information about JNF JNF USA, visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, we'd all love to hear from you. So do email us at IsraelCast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.